Speaking of which, affirmative action. That's somewhat of a touchy subject here in America. Originally designed as a form of remediation to eliminate the, quote, badges of slavery of African Americans in this country, and to recognize their uniquely difficult journey. That's all according to Senator Jim Webb, who recently wrote an op-ed on this issue. But the thing is, it's also about creating diversity. And yet now that it applies to all people of color, to Asians and to Latin Americans that have only recently immigrated, some are asking if it's turned into a form of discrimination against all whites. So do the poorest white Americans, whose families have lived here for centuries, maybe decades, do they always get cut in line by those that have just moved here because of the color of their skin? Well, joining me is Jared Taylor, editor of the American Renaissance, and from our LA studio, Adam Lerman, organizer for Affirmative Action Group By Any Means Necessary. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. We'll start here in the studio. To you, affirmative action, because people describe it differently, do you think that it's about reparations and about equality, or is it about diversity?
Well, I think a more appropriate expression for it is not affirmative action, but racial preferences. That's what it is. It's preferential treatment of people because of their race. It's as simple as that. And if it was being done in the name of affirmative action, if it was being done for whites, it would be considered a national scandal. But because it's for blacks and Hispanics, it's considered okay. Now, the idea that it's reparations for slavery is completely nuts, certainly in the case of Hispanics who've just immigrated, Africans who've just immigrated, and in fact, today, most beneficiaries of affirmative action are not ghetto blacks. They're people from middle-class black families. Their parents benefited from affirmative action. How long is this going to go on?
Now, Adam, what do you say to that? Do you think that this has nothing to do with reparations and quite the opposite, it's racial discrimination?
I think it has to do with reparations only insofar as the effects of discrimination and racism continue to exist today. I think that to say that we've moved past, discrimination and inequality and racism just flies in the face of the reality of this country, and every sociological, every socioeconomic statistic and measure of inequality shows a growing chasm between minorities and non-minorities. And while it is true that there are white people in this country, obviously, who are not getting treated fairly, the answer is not, in my opinion, and in my organization's opinion, not to blame other victims of discrimination, but instead to build a united fight, to fight for more resources for everybody.
But in that case, why does race even have to be an issue here? Because really, it's about socioeconomic status. And we're saying that there are poor white people, poor Hispanic people, poor black people. So why is race a part of affirmative action?
Because, you see, that's not the way it works at all. When people have tried to use poverty as a proxy for race, because they say, oh, we can't get into this race business, what they find is they're helping out white people, and they're not getting the kind of racial diversity, which is the great image that we want to bow down to at this point.
The truth is that we have to take account of race, because racism actually still shapes everyday life in America. Everything in this recession shows that black Americans are suffering worse from the recession. If you look at the admission statistics to colleges and universities around the country, you see a decreasing percentage of minority students on these campuses, not increasing as the opponents of affirmative action would like us to believe. So let's look at the facts of what actually discrimination, inequality is in this country, not what people wish it were.
First of all, it is a big mistake to say just because there are differences in achievement of representation, it's a consequence of racism. Look at the National Basketball Association. It's 77% black. Is that because whites are being discriminated against? No. One of the great false arguments of the proponents of affirmative action is to say, point to any difference and say that had to be discrimination. Most of the time, that is completely false, even if it were discrimination.
But do you believe that racism is not a problem that still exists in America?
I think racism is by no means this overwhelming, terrible obstacle to blacks or Hispanics. Why are so many Hispanics coming here if racism is such a problem? Why is it that there are more Africans who have immigrated voluntarily to the United States than ever came in the slave trade? If this country were just brimming
I would
with
invite
racism,
you to go to the city of Detroit and ask them if they think racism is a problem.
Well, yes, in the city of Detroit, they've got a black mayor, a black police chief.
Go into East LA and see if it's a problem in East LA.
Yes, East LA is likewise run by Hispanics. Who are they going to blame it on? Some distant white man. This is the constant refrain. oh, it's not my fault. It's that ugly, nasty white man that did it to me. When are non-whites going to grow up is what I'd like to know. When are they going to take responsibility for their own situation?
Well, pretty soon
when
they're
are people
going
like
to be...
you going to start misrepresenting the truth
Well,
about what America looks like?
Yeah. I think, you know, what you also need to address is California is a perfect example. That's a state where minorities are going to be the majority of the population pretty soon. California, you're right, already is that way. The rest of America is going to reflect that pretty soon. So this is going to be the reality. Well, how is that going to change the playing field? Then, you know, at that point, are we going to see fewer whites getting into universities because there's fewer of them, or are they still always going to have the upper hand?
At this point, the way so-called affirmative action works, the idea that it's somehow compensation for what happened 150 years ago is rubbish. It's simply a means of gaining advantage at the expense of others. It's gaining advantage at the expense of others. Now, when blacks and Hispanics become a majority, if they want to legislate the laws that even go further to discriminate against whites, there'll be nothing to stop them. But let's face it what it is. It is seeking advantage at the expense of whites and sometimes Asians.
Well, I doubt they'll be legislating the laws, considering that they'll probably never get to be a lawmaker, because you know that it takes a lot of money to get into political office these days. But, Adam, what do you consider affirmative action then?
Let's look at the city of Los Angeles and the state of California. I like that. Let's be concrete and talk about some truth. The city of Los Angeles, the public schools here are 75% Latino, the public schools. Yet if you go onto campus at UCLA or any of the larger, elite universities here in the state of California, Latinos are wholly underrepresented, and that's not changing. That's getting worse. In fact, in California, we don't have affirmative action. It was banned by a state constitutional amendment in 1997, Prop 209, that, in fact, my group is now suing in federal court to overturn, because we've seen what 10 years of the ban on affirmative action has meant for the people of California. In a majority-minority state, in a majority-minority city, you go across the street here to UCLA. 3 years ago, there were less than 100 black freshmen on that campus who were not on athletic scholarship. You tell me that's equality. You tell me that's what America's supposed to be.
What you're saying, you're talking about quotas. It's pure and simple. And you're saying that because there are not as many, they have to be beneficiaries of racial discrimination. You're saying that
how do we measure equality? How do we measure justice?
We measure justice by treating everybody equally. You're saying we can't treat them equally. We have to give them a leg up, give them a boost, give them extra points on their scores. That's exactly what you're saying. More points for minorities because of the color of their skin, even if they just immigrated yesterday. That's what you're saying.
I think the big question here also, like both of you mentioned, is how do you measure equality? Is diversity necessarily the word that represents equality, or is this some other American notion that isn't really taking into account, come on, this is, we're in a recession, socioeconomic barriers definitely exist in this country, and I think we have to continue this debate. I want to thank you, gentlemen, both for being here tonight, but we will continue to discuss this here on the show.
Thanks for having us.